So my goal for this talk today is to give an introduction to clinical research. I know it's something a lot of you have heard about and read about, and I'd like to answer more questions about that. My name is Carolyn. I'm a genetic counselor here at Lurie Children's Hospital, and I work in clinical research or with clinical research trials that we're doing. My email address is up there as well, so if after the talk you have questions about clinical trials, you're always welcome to reach out to me. There's three main questions that I was hoping to address today. The first one is, what are clinical trials? The second question we'll address is, how do you find and learn about clinical trials? And the final question we'll talk about today is, how do I decide if a trial is a good fit? There's a lot of points underneath that topic, and I think it's one of the most important questions for each of you to ask yourself. So starting with, what are clinical trials? Clinical trials are developed after preclinical work has been completed and met satisfactory results. So preclinical work can include animal studies and other studies that are done to decide if it's safe to move into a clinical trial for humans. There are 4 phases of clinical research. That includes, we'll get into all 4 of them, but it includes different milestones that are important to the development of a new treatment and deciding if it can move into being an approved treatment option for a specific condition. The phases are not always consecutive, especially when we think about some genetic conditions or rare conditions. We may combine phases during research because we are addressing more than one question at a time. The first phase of clinical trials are study drugs given to humans for the first time. So when we are talking about a phase 1 study, it means that we don't have any previous information about how a treatment option or a study treatment option has been used in humans previously. This is what we typically call the safety study, because the main question that we're trying to answer is about how safe this new potential treatment could be. There's usually a small number of subjects enrolled. In some cases, a phase 1 trial enrolls healthy individuals first, just to see what safety considerations need to be taken into place. But in other cases, we will have a small number of individuals that have a specific diagnosis that a treatment or study treatment is trying to treat. The main questions that we're asking in phase 1 are, what is a safe dose range to decide what dosing will work for individuals, and then also to collect adverse events, so potential side effects that a study drug could have. Next, we move into phase 2 clinical trials. In phase 2 clinical trials, we still typically have a small number of subjects, but more than we would see in a phase 1 trial. Subjects always have the medical condition being studied. So when you reach a phase 2 study, you are focusing on enrolling individuals that have a specific diagnosis like PA or MMA that you're trying to treat. The phase 2 may also be used to make comparisons. And so we can compare what it's like to be on study drug compared to not being on study drug. What we call this is double blind with placebo. And so a placebo is just when we give something that looks like the study treatment, but does not actually have the study drug in it. And so that way all individuals are still taking something, but we just don't know who's taking the study drug and who's taking the fake drug, for example. And then that way afterwards we can compare if we saw a difference between the individuals that were actually on study drug. The reason that we call this blinded is because we, as a research team, typically also don't know which of our patients are on the studied drug or which of the patients are not. And so that allows us to make a better comparison without thinking that something's happening just because we know that they're on a study drug. A study drug could also be compared to an already approved drug. So even in conditions that have approved treatment options or things that might help with symptoms, we know that we're learning more every single day to try to create new treatments that work even better. And so we can compare new study treatments to currently approved drugs as well. In phase 2, the main questions that we are trying to ask are to see if a drug can treat the medical condition using the safe dose range, and then also continuing to collect safety information. That's something that you will see throughout all the phases, is that we're always collecting safety information so we can continue to know how safe a drug is or if safety changes over time as we learn more and collect more data. The next phase we move into is phase 3 clinical trials. At this stage, these are conducted if phase 1 and phase 2 trials are successful. So you wouldn't skip to a phase 3 trial. At this point, we're able to enroll larger numbers of subjects. We also might start to adjust inclusion and exclusion criteria. So in some clinical trials, in phase 1 and phase 2, they start off with more strict inclusion or exclusion criteria. And maybe you've seen a trial that your child doesn't qualify for. It's helpful to keep following up with it if it's something that you might be interested in, following up with your healthcare team, because if it moves into a phase 3 trial, at that point, the criteria might change and you may be able to qualify where you hadn't before. Usually we start to increase the number of study sites as well. So sometimes another barrier to participating in a clinical trial is the location. And so that's something else that you can pay attention to as we move into different phases of trials. We start to increase the number, and there might be a site that opens up that's closer to you and makes traveling to that site possible. With these trials, the main questions that we're asking now are collecting long-term safety data. So before we were thinking about safety information in the short term, and when we get to phase 3, we're starting to think about the long-term safety. Sometimes that can change from the short term. We also collect long-term data on how well the study drug works. So does it continue to work the same way over time? Does it start to lose effectiveness? Those are questions that we can answer at this stage. Sometimes trials also have a phase 3B. This is not something that every single trial has to have, and it's not always that common, and it's not necessarily required. But the main purpose, if a sponsor does decide to do a phase 3B trial, would be, again, to continue to collect additional safety data, gather more information for other indications of the study drug. So maybe thinking about what the study drug is helping. And so at that point, you could have like different targets, or what we call endpoints for a study. So the treatment helps with this symptom, but not with this other symptom. So in phase 3B, you might focus in on all the different symptoms that a treatment is helping with. The last thing that you might consider in a phase 3B study is gathering data on special subsets of subjects. So we know symptoms or manifestations of conditions can vary between individuals. And so when you're doing a phase 3B study, you can start to think about subsets of the patient populations and focusing in on how it treats different manifestations. Finally, we get to phase 4 clinical trials. So this is an exciting stage. This usually happens once we have FDA approval, and it's an ongoing trial. So even after initial FDA approval, studies can continue on to collect additional data. This might be required by the FDA if they want additional long-term data after approval. And sometimes study treatments can get a conditional approval that after the additional collection of data, they'll get a final approval from the FDA. And the phase 4 information can be really helpful there. The main purpose is to continue to collect the long-term safety data, so looking at the long-term effects of drug, both safety-wise, and then collecting long-term data on how well a drug works. So we know the more data that we can gather on more patients and how they're being treated, the better we can answer a question about how well a drug is working and how good of an option it is. An example of this is disease registries. They can be really important for understanding symptoms of diseases, but also for how well treatments are working. Okay. The next part that I'm going to go into is the question of how do I find and learn about clinical trials? There's lots of different resources available to you if you know where to look and how you want to look. So I'll talk through a few different ones. The first thing I'm going to go through is navigating clinicaltrials.gov. So clinicaltrials.gov is a website that's maintained by the US government. All clinical research trials that go through the FDA are required to be on clinicaltrials.gov. In addition, any research study that has any funding by a national organization or a federal grant would also be required to go through clinicaltrials.gov. So this is a very good resource to start with. It's one of the more comprehensive resources, but there might not be, not all studies are going to be listed here, but it's a good place to start. On the homepage of clinicaltrials.gov, you can start with deciding what you want to search for. The first thing to search for is the status of a clinical trial. So that indicates if a study is currently enrolling subjects. So you can pay attention to that piece. Sometimes if you do a search and you click all studies, then studies will show up that have already concluded or no longer have spots filled for them. On here, you can select recruiting and not yet recruiting trials to filter for studies that are currently looking or getting ready to look for subjects. The next piece here is the condition or disease being studied. So this is where you would type in propionic acidemia or methylmalonic acidemia to filter for clinical trials that are specific to the diagnosis that you're looking for. You can also include some other terms to help narrow down your search. This might be including a specific study drug. So if you've talked with another family or talked with your healthcare provider and are looking for more information about a specific study drug that you heard about, you could type that in here, or just other things that might help you narrow down your search. The last feature here I think is a really nice one and an important one for trying to find studies that might work well for you, and it's picking the studies that are located close to you. You start off by putting in the country, there's just putting in the United States, but then you can also narrow down by state, city, and they have a distance option as well. So you can say, I want trials that are within 10 miles, 20 miles, 30, 40. If you're willing to drive a longer distance, you can filter. If that doesn't seem like it's something that's going to be feasible for you, then you can filter those types of trials that are not located near you out right away. Once you do that search, I'm going to go through some of the results that would come up for both propionic acidemia and then methylmalonic acidemia. So starting with propionic acidemia, when you type in that search, what pops up is a list. There are 8 studies currently. I know this slide is not very viewable. The idea is just that there are a number of studies that come up, and we'll talk a little bit more about those results on the next slide. And then there's additional filter options at this point too once you've started your search. So you can just pick more details about recruitment status, so you can switch to just currently recruiting or not yet recruiting. You can also look at some of the eligibility criteria to help eliminate options that wouldn't be available to you. So starting with age, if the affected individual in your family is a child, then you can filter to only include studies that are enrolling children. If the affected individual in your family is an adult, then you can filter to do only studies that are enrolling adults, or you can look for studies that enroll both. You can also see if there are any studies that are specific to the child or individual sex. There's additional filters down the side, and you can play with those and add them as you want to help decide what type of trials you're looking for. So with propionic acidemia, when you type that into clinicaltrials.gov and look for recruiting or not yet recruiting, which means that the study is getting ready to recruit, there are 8 studies listed. 4 of them are interventional studies, and 4 of them are observational studies. So to talk about the difference between those two, an interventional study is a study that does have some sort of treatment that is being given, or study treatment that is being given for that study. They're trying to understand how a treatment might help the condition. And then for observational studies, this is more information that's collected on the disease, on manifestations, collecting data that can be really helpful to inform future clinical trials, to inform how we are treating individuals, to inform what symptoms are the biggest concern that we as healthcare providers and as researchers should be focusing on. So even studies that are not interventional are super important and something to consider. For the interventional studies for PA, there's 1 phase 1 drug trial, 1 phase 2 drug trial, and then 2 phase 1 and 2. So that's an example of some of those combined trials where they combine phases. And then with the observational studies, there's a registry study, 1 treatment specifically observing treatment with carboglue. So that treatment is not being studied in this study, but we're more just collecting data on its use. And then 2 studies that don't specify what phase they are, might not have a category that they're in. Now doing the same thing with methylmalonic acidemia, when we pull that up, there are 6 studies that pop up on clinicaltrials.gov. Here we have 3 interventional studies and 3 observational studies. So that includes 1 phase 1 drug trial, a phase 2 drug trial, and 1 phase 1/2 trial. And for the observational studies, there's 1 registry study, an observational study looking at treatment with carboglue, and then 1 other study that didn't specify a category. Once you click on a specific search option, so when you click on this list here, if you see a study title or you see information that you want, or maybe it's a location that you think would work well for you, you can click on the study title itself to learn more information. And what you'll see on that page is a study description or an overview of the study, probably some of the key information that is going to be helpful for understanding what the study is about. It'll talk about study design, so what is going to happen in the study? Are there multiple parts to the study that an individual enrolled would go through, like Part A, Part B, Part C? You can also see if there are interventions in arms or parts of the study, outcome measures, and then eligibility criteria as well. So this is one of the first places you can look to see how the inclusion and exclusion criteria would work with the individual in your family that is considering enrolling. And then finally, you can get contacts and locations. So this is a great place to start. I will say sometimes when you look at the inclusion and exclusion criteria, it can be hard on your own to say, I'm not sure if this fits with my child or the individual in my family considering the trial. And so you can contact the study coordinators at a given location and have more detailed conversation with them if it's something you're interested in. The next resource I want to highlight are the family groups. You guys are all here today because you are familiar with the Propionic Acidemia Foundation. The Organic Acidemia Association is another family group. These groups are often putting in a lot of time and a lot of work into staying up to date on clinical trials, on research opportunities, or even funding their own registries. Like I know the PAF has a registry themselves that they maintain and keep funded. And so you can reach out to these groups, talk to other families that are part of the group and hear about their experiences. I always like to say, you can talk with healthcare providers all day and we can give you a lot of information, but there is no better resource than another family to talk about the day-to-day experience, because they're the ones living the same thing as you. And then finally, you can talk with trusted healthcare providers. When you go to an appointment, ask at an appointment, make it a habit to ask at an appointment, are there any clinical trials going on right now? Are there any clinical trials that you think we would qualify for? They might say yes, they might say no, but it's always helpful to ask and start that conversation. If it's something that you're interested in, it also helps them know that next time, as soon as they hear about any trials, then they can keep you in mind to share those updates. The final question that I wanted to get into then is, how do you decide if a clinical trial is a good fit? So like I said at the beginning, I think this is the most important question. There's lots of different types of trials, and it's important to know what trial is a good fit for you. Clinical trials are voluntary, but they can be really, really helpful for us to learn more things for future treatment. One of the key things that is helpful in trying to decide if a trial is a good fit for you is the informed consent process. So what the informed consent process does is it provides you with key information about a research study before you decide whether to accept the offer to take part. It's an opportunity for you to talk with members of the research team or with your clinical team to help you decide whether the study is a good fit. And I always like to remember, and the consent process is a good place to emphasize that, again, that clinical trials are voluntary, and so you can go through a consent process to really think about the study in detail and decide what you want to do. While informed consent is always something that happens before enrolling in a trial, informed consent is something that can change over time. So maybe a study changes, there's new information available, your research team would always keep you up to date on that. But at any point in time, you can also say, you know what, I changed my mind. There's new information, or I've just thought about it more and my mind has changed, and you can always take away your consent to continue participating at any time, and that never affects the clinical care that you receive from your care team. The consent process can include multiple different parts depending on the age of the individual being enrolled. So adults that are enrolling in this study, or individuals that are over 18 years of age or older, are able to make their own medical decisions typically. And so if they are able to do so, then they would complete an adult consent form. If there is an individual in which they have a legal guardian that's helping make medical decisions for them, then we would also have this conversation with that legal guardian. On consent forms, we often call that the legally authorized representative. There's also parental consent. So for individuals that are under the age of 18, one or two parents would need to complete the parental consent form. And then for adolescents, we like to include them in the discussion about research as well. And so at an adolescent age, once a child reaches 12 years old, then we make sure that they are included in the discussion. There's an assent form that's a little bit shorter than the full consent form, but it gives a way for them to participate in the conversation and make sure that they're aware of what they're getting ready to sign up for as well. There's multiple parts of informed consent form. It's usually a long process. I think it's always really helpful to start the conversation slowly, talk about the study, continue to talk about more details over time, and eventually complete the full consent form. There's a lot of information to think about, and it's not an information that you can just think about over the course of 1 hour. It's better to be able to talk about it, think about it, keep asking questions before you sit down and actually sign the forms. But with the consent forms, key components that you will always see are the purpose and goal of the study, how long the study is going to be, the number of visits that's going to take place, the tests and procedures that will be done, risks involved with the study, potential benefits either to you or to the disease population being studied in general, who to contact for additional information, and then also if there's compensation or support for taking part and giving your time for the study. Some of the key things that I want to highlight, because in my time working in research, I see them as some of the bigger challenges with participating or deciding to participate in research, are the next few slides. So the first one is time commitment. The time it takes to be in a study can vary study to study, and it's important to think about that for yourself before deciding to enroll or have your child enroll. So to help understand how much time is needed to participate, these are some of the different questions that are related to time that can be helpful. So how long visits are, how many visits there are, how frequently visits occur, and how long the study will last. And so these are all different components of time that end up taking time. Maybe the visits are really, really long, but they don't happen that often. So you're like, okay, I can put up with a few long days over time. Maybe the visits are shorter, but more frequently. Maybe it's a mix of both. And so that's something to help you start visualizing what the commitment's gonna look like once you enroll. Other information to think about is compensation and resources. So this is the other big factor that I think plays a large role in families deciding what's going to be a good fit for them. A lot of studies recognize this, and they want to support that for the families that are considering participating. And so some of the compensation and resources to think about and to ask about when you're talking about clinical trials is travel reimbursement, transportation costs, so whether it's paying for you to have your own transportation, which would be the reimbursement, or paying for transportation to take you to and from a study visits. Lodging, if you are traveling to a study location that is not close to you, sometimes lodging can be covered. Meals, if there are really long days, then there can be funds available to help cover meals while you are at the study site. And then sometimes there's also time reimbursement to recognize the amount of time that you are taking away from other things as well. Additional questions to consider, and these are just a few of them. I know it's really small at the bottom, but if you look on your slides, there is a link to the NIH site that has additional questions listed for you to think about as you consider studies. But some of the ones I wanted to highlight include, why do researchers think the approach may be effective? I think this can be a helpful question for understanding how a study got to the point of a clinical trial. What will my responsibilities be if I participate? So again, what is the commitment that you're making? What are my possible short-term and long-term benefits and or risks? What other options are available outside of this study treatment? How do the tests in the study compare with those I would have outside of the trial? And how could being in this study affect my daily life? I think those are all really helpful questions to think about as you're visualizing participating in a trial. Okay, the last slide I want to emphasize is, how do clinical trials make a difference? Clinical trials help understand new ways to treat and manage medical conditions. They teach us about safety and effectiveness. Clinical trials are a collaboration between researchers, clinicians, and the communities of individuals that have medical conditions. It's just as the families and patients that have the families and patients that have these medical conditions are just as important of a player in our clinical research and research efforts as the clinicians and researchers themselves. Participation in clinical trials is essential to making new scientific advances. So the treatments that are available today are because of research that's been done in the past. And the things that will be available 10 years from now or even 5 years from now are because of research that's going on right now. And finally, clinical trials are always voluntary, and you should only consider participating or having your child participate if it really, at the end of the day, does feel right to you. So with that, I will take any questions. You can tell we've gotten to the afternoon.
Carolyn, how about maybe letting people know how many years on average is each phase of a clinical trial, so people kind of understand the duration of how long it takes to get a new therapy approved in the United States?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So usually there's several years involved in clinical trials. Part of that is because each phase will take a couple to a few years. It can vary depending on the study. One thing that impacts how long a trial takes is how many individuals are enrolled into a trial. Often, in order to move from phase 1 to phase 2 or phase 2 to phase 3, you have to enroll a minimum number of patients to collect the right amount of safety data and effectiveness data to move into the next phase. But I would say on average, working through a study, we could see like a trial taking like 3 to 5 years for phase 1 or phase 2. And then the long-term trials are looking at long-term data can go on for several years to keeping track of data.